Okay, so here we are in our living room. We're right next to the fireplace, and the clock is positioned between two large picture windows which overlook the river valley, next to some other antique pieces of equipment, some other old clocks. But this is the focus right now. So I've collected clocks for a long time. I mean, even when I was young, my family had some old clocks, which I still have, fortunately. And then I started collecting them. I'd go to flea markets or antique shops, and I never spent a lot of money on clocks. I would usually buy old clocks and I would fix them up a little bit. But of course, the grandfather of all clocks is the grandfather clock. It's the biggest clock. It's actually called a tall case clock or a wall clock. And they were the most accurate because they had the longest pendulum, which really helped regulate the time more perfectly. Because of its height, you can have long weights, so it can run for 8 days without rewinding. And of course, the resonance that you get out of this beautifully built wooden case, it just sounds like the sounding board of a piano almost when it resonates. And there's these metal chime rods in the back. And when the clock strikes, a series of hammers inside hit those chime rods and give you that really pure sound. I hadn't planned to buy a grandfather clock. I'd always hoped to buy one someday. Good ones are very expensive. And also, you know, how many clocks do you need? And my wife reminded me I don't really need another clock. But I went into our local antique shop, G's Treasures, which I like to go in there and just see what kind of things they have. And lo and behold, this was in there. And it said $895 on it. So I thought, that's fine, I can't afford that. I don't have to worry about it. I can just admire it without being tempted. But the owner, who I knew, came up to me and thought that I was really showing great interest in it. And he offered a much lower price for me. And then we talked about I could barter for it because I collect other antiques. So I brought in a series of other things, an old barometer, a guitar, an old tin toy ship, and we struck a bargain. I traded some things that I have had for years for this clock. Another big part of buying this clock was how to get it home, because you don't just take a clock like this and throw it in the back of a car. You can damage it seriously by doing that. So you have to do several things. First of all, you take the pendulum, which unhooks from the mechanism, and you gently take the pendulum out and you wrap it and you put it in a nice box. Then these weights, which are quite heavy actually, and you take the weights off, and you have to wear nice gloves when you do that, because these weights are polished brass, and if you handle them with your bare hands, you actually could create some tarnish on the brass that you'd have to polish out later. So you take the weights off and you pack them separately. Then you have to put the chime rods are hard to see from here, but the chime rods are thin pieces of wire that hang down. And you gently wrap those in like a very soft towel. Then we laid the clock on its back, carried it through the shop, one person on each end. had my car pulled up outside the shop and gently put it into the back of my car, drove it here. So the other part of the process again was, where do you put a clock like this? And so I actually, with Photoshop, I took some pictures of it in the antique shop, brought it home, did some different pictures in the house, and Photoshopped it into different walls in different places. And it was actually my daughter suggested this spot. We just moved this old captain's cabinet over just a couple feet or so from the dining table. You can see the clock. From the living room, you can see the clock. And as you walk in our front door, you can also see the clock. So it actually fit in perfectly. Once we got it here, of course, we brought it into its place. The next big thing to do is to level the clock. Now, fortunately, on the bottom of this clock are levels. Down here, there's adjustments that you turn to level it, because you want this thing to be leveled this way and forward and backwards so that the pendulum can swing properly. I will tell you, a grandfather clock is a pretty interesting machine. I mean, all clocks are, but grandfather clocks are sort of the height of clocks, if you will. They work on gravity. Unlike a wind-up clock or an electric clock, it's the gravity of these pretty heavy weights that turn the mechanism that make the clock work. Opening the case reveals the true guts of it. We have the pendulum, which regulates the speed. We have the weights, which supply the power. We have the face and the dial hands. So you'll see here, the way you raise the weights is you turn this crank right here. You'll see the weights are driven up by a cable drum. The center weight is for the actual clock mechanism, the time. The other two weights, and they wind here and here, are for the chimes. This particular clock has 3 different chimes that you can choose, and you can also choose a silent mode. The most popular is the Westminster chime, which is the same as Big Ben. The other thing we have up here is a moon dial, which is pretty neat. And this is, you synchronize it to the full moon, and the clock, as it turns, it changes this slightly, and you can actually watch the phases of the moon. And I can see right now the moon is waning, meaning it's getting smaller. As the month goes on, the moon will rise again and become a full moon. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Now, the clock runs perfectly. It's been keeping perfect time since we brought it here. The only problem with this clock is the chime is very, very slow. And that happens for one of 2 reasons. Either the mechanism inside is worn out, the actual pivots, the brass pivots are worn and it's slow, or it's just really dirty. So I'm going to take the whole thing apart, clean it and oil it, and see if that solves it. If it doesn't solve it, I'd buy a new German movement. I can still buy the exact same movement that this clock originally had and put the movement in, and that'll be a brand new clock. Now, when we make this thing chime, you'll really hear that not only is a grandfather clock a time machine, it is a beautiful resonant sound box. And this is all hardwood, and it's got a sounding vents in the sides here, and it really is nice. But you'll notice as soon as I make it chime, the Big Ben notes, the Westminster chime is slow, but then you'll hear the great striking 12-hour gongs. So that's one cycle. It'll do a second cycle before it gongs the hour. And where I'm standing right here, I can really feel the sound as well as hear it. So this is an 8-day clock. When you wind it fully, when you pull the weights all the way to the top, it will run smoothly for 8 days. This center power weight will drop all the way down to the bottom, and then you wind it up again. It's an 8-day clock so that you wind it once a week, but if you forget, you've got an extra day leeway. The key is a real key lock that really functions. And even something as simple as the winding crank is pretty cool, simple mechanism, rather than a winding key that you'd find in a smaller clock. And it's very satisfying to come in here and wind the pendulums up into their position. But I think it's a beautiful piece, and I have some plans to put a more traditional moon dial on it that has a actual, a dark blue background with little stars and a nice moon face, more traditional. So I'm going to upgrade a little bit, customize it. What I really love, it's a machine. It actually is a large machine. And the fact that without any electricity, it just keeps going, basically simply worked on my cranking up these weights, and then gravity does the rest. And I'm very proud of it, and it just gives me pleasure. Something in this modern day and age that's not connected to the grid, not connected to the power grid or the internet, and yet it just, as they say, it's timeless. And we'll keep you posted on how the repairs go, and hopefully we can get that chime working more quickly so it sounds a lot more like the pace of Big Ben that we're all familiar with. See you next time around.